There was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps, almost as if someone was testing the door's strength. A strange unease settled in her stomach. With trembling fingers, she reached for the door handle, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she cracked it open. No one was there. Just the empty street, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. Amber's blood turned to ice. She turned around slowly, her mind racing. From the darkness of the living room, a familiar voice whispered, "They're already inside." The chill of Halloween night settled over the suburban neighborhood of Crestwood like a heavy fog. Amber Lee stood at her front door, a bowl of candy in hand, watching as the first wave of trick-or-treaters approached. She counted them, like she did every year. 12 kids. Always 12. Dressed in costumes ranging from superheroes to witches, their small faces glowing with excitement under the dim streetlights. Amber's house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, away from the others, with a front yard that stretched wider than most. Her porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the pumpkin-lined walkway. She felt a pang of nostalgia, remembering the years when she, too, had wandered these streets, her father at her side, before everything changed. "Happy Halloween," Amber called, forcing a smile as the kids approached. "Trick or treat," they chorused, voices muffled by plastic masks. She handed out candy, carefully portioning it, all while her eyes scanned the group. 12. Just as it should be. She sighed in relief as the last of them ran off, their laughter fading into the distance. The warmth of the moment was fleeting, though, and Amber retreated inside, shutting the door softly behind her. But as she set the candy bowl down on the counter, there was another knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps, almost as if someone was testing the door's strength. She paused, her hand hovering over the bowl, a strange unease settling in her stomach. It's late for another group, she thought. Everyone should be heading home by now. The neighborhood wasn't exactly known for its large crowds, especially with only a dozen kids around. Amber opened the door. Standing there, in the orange glow of the porch light, was a child, a small figure in a tattered black cloak with a hood pulled low over their face. They clutched a plastic pumpkin pail in their hand. The outfit was simple, but the way the child stood, silent and still, sent a shiver down Amber's spine. Hi, she said, forcing a smile. "A little late, aren't you?" The child didn't respond, didn't move. Just stood there, head slightly bowed, the hood casting deep shadows over their face. Amber felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. "Trick or treat," she tried again, more awkwardly. She looked out at the street behind the child, no parents in sight. No sign of the familiar group of kids that had just left. That's strange, she thought. Her heart began to beat faster. "Where are your friends?" she asked, her voice softer now, concern lacing the edges of her words. The child remained silent. Amber's fingers tightened around the candy bowl, her mind racing. There were only 12 kids in the neighborhood, always 12. No one new had moved in. This didn't make sense. "I'm sorry, but I think it's getting late," she said, trying to sound gentle. "Why don't you head home?" The child's head tilted up slightly, and in the faint light, Amber saw something she couldn't quite place. It was the eyes, 2 dark, hollow orbs, almost too large for the face. A coldness crept into her veins as her instinct to close the door kicked in. Just as her hand moved toward the handle, the child spoke, its voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going home." Amber froze, her breath catching in her throat. The words hung in the air like a fog, and something about the way the child said them made her chest tighten with dread. "Excuse me," she whispered, trying to steady herself. "They'll be here soon," the child continued, its head turning ever so slightly toward the empty street behind them. "For you." A sharp pang of fear shot through Amber. She instinctively took a step back, her mind reeling. "Who's coming?" she demanded, though her voice wavered. Before the child could answer, a sudden crash from the kitchen sent Amber spinning around. The bowl of candy she had set on the counter was now on the floor, candy scattered everywhere. Her pulse quickened. She whipped back toward the door, but the child was gone. She blinked, stepping outside, eyes darting from house to house. Nothing. The street was still. Silent. Too silent. She slammed the door shut and pressed her back against it, trying to catch her breath. This is just a prank. Kids messing around. But deep down, Amber knew it was something more. Something connected to the past she had long tried to bury. Amber's mind spun as her breathing grew shallow. She looked back at the door, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might burst. Then, the second knock came, louder this time, more urgent. Amber's breath hitched. She stared at the door, frozen. Was the child back? Or something worse? With trembling fingers, she reached for the door handle, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she cracked it open. No one was there. Just the empty street, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. Amber's blood turned to ice. She turned around slowly, her mind racing. From the darkness of the living room, a familiar voice whispered, "They're already inside." Amber's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to move, to run, but her legs felt frozen in place, anchored by fear. She turned back toward the darkness of her living room. The voice, faint, familiar, still echoed in her ears, "They're already inside." Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to step forward. Her eyes scanned the room, her heart pounding against her ribcage. Nothing seemed out of place. The living room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But the silence didn't comfort her, it felt oppressive, like something lurking just beyond her sight. Amber considered going to Mrs. Hastings's house, just across the street. The woman had always been kind, the sort of neighborhood grandma who kept an eye on everything and everyone. But the thought of stepping outside, into the eerie, quiet street where that strange child had been, made her chest tighten with dread. The doorbell rang. Amber jumped slowly, she crept toward the front door, her breath shallow. "Amber, open up," a voice called from the other side. It was Mrs. Hastings. Relief washed over her, but only for a moment. Something about the voice sounded off. Like it was straining, too eager. Amber leaned closer to the door, pressing her ear against it. "Mrs. Hastings," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, dear," the voice responded, though it was too flat, too rehearsed. "Let me in." The hair on the back of Amber's neck stood up. She stepped back from the door. Her fingers itched to twist the lock, to open it, but something deep inside her screamed not to. A pause. Then the voice changed, darker, lower. "Let me in, Amber." Her stomach clenched. She backed away from the door, heart racing, as the voice, no longer Mrs. Hastings, kept repeating, "Let me in, Amber. Let me in." Suddenly, a loud bang against the door made her scream, the sound reverberating through the quiet house. The pounding was relentless, faster and harder with each hit. Panicked, Amber turned and ran for the back door. She fumbled with the lock, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The door clicked open, and she bolted outside into the cold night air.
The night air was bitter, laced with a sense of finality that I hadn't felt in years. Amber had vanished, just like her father had 10 years ago on the same night, under the same dark curse. The door she'd bolted through still hung open, swaying gently in the breeze. The town, now silent, seemed to breathe in the loss, the price it had once again demanded. I had hoped it would be different with Amber. For years, I'd watched the families in this neighborhood thrive. Our town's prosperity was undeniable, businesses boomed, homes were secure, and our children were healthy and happy. To an outsider, we were the picture of the perfect community, untouched by the struggles that plagued others. But we knew better. We understood the price we paid for this seemingly charmed existence. The 13th trick-or-treater. Every Halloween, the whispers would start. Parents would hold their children a little closer, counting heads nervously as the kids raced from house to house, their costumes bright and carefree under the streetlights. There were always 12 children in the neighborhood, no more, no less. But somehow there was always a 13th. A child no one could recognize. A figure that slipped through the shadows, silent and eerie, collecting its due. The families knew what it meant when the 13th trick-or-treater came knocking. Some thought they could avoid it, fool themselves into thinking this year would be different. Others, like Amber's father, tried to bargain with it. But the truth was, once the 13th trick-or-treater arrived at your door, there were only two options: offer up what it asked for, or face the consequences. Amber's father had learned the hard way. He'd refused. Thought he could outsmart it, outmaneuver a curse that had haunted this town for generations. And for a while, it seemed like he had. Until the night he disappeared, leaving behind nothing but the faint smell of smoke and the eerie quiet that followed his final words. "They're coming." Amber had been only a child then, too young to understand the gravity of the curse that would one day fall to her. And just like her father, she'd resisted. When the 13th trick-or-treater appeared, Amber had chosen to run. But you can't run from a curse. Not in this town. Refusal sealed her fate. I had seen it before, many times, with families who thought they could break the cycle. They always disappeared, leaving behind only grief and unanswered questions. But the rest of us knew the truth. We accepted it because we had to. The town's prosperity was built on sacrifice, on the blood and tears of those who vanished into the night. I looked around the neighborhood, the houses dark and still. Behind those doors, families slept peacefully, safe in their prosperity. But it wouldn't last forever. Next year, the 13th trick-or-treater would come again, and another family would be chosen. They always were. I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at my insides. I had watched Amber, hoped for her to find a way to escape the fate her father had tried to protect her from. But the curse doesn't let go easily. No one can break it. The 13th trick-or-treater had taken her, just like it had taken him. And now, the town would continue to prosper. Children would play in the streets, unaware of the dark history that underpinned their laughter. Families would build their lives here, thinking themselves lucky. And I would continue to watch. Because someone always has to know. Someone has to remember that behind the prosperity, behind the safety and the charm, there is a cost. Amber's disappearance would fade into memory, just another cautionary tale whispered around Halloween fires. But I would remember. I always remember.